During World War II, not only were soldiers facing the horrors of war, in their downtime, they were looking forward to getting letters and notes from their family and loved ones. Except nothing was coming their way. The reality of it was that the mail was backed up by months and in some places, by years. Families, waiting to hear back from their loved ones in the midst of this horrendous war, heard nothing but silence. The 688th Battalion was formed to combat that part of the war by going through the immense backlog of letters that had been set aside and forgotten about. They were extraordinary in their distinction as they were the first Black, female American military unit that served overseas. Thanks to their dedication, working 24/7 in 3 shifts and in freezing cold conditions, they managed to single-handedly solve the male morale crisis that was facing millions of military service people. This is the story of the 688. I'm your host, Lauren Powers, and you are listening to Not Your History Class podcast. Our standard education has barely touched upon the depth, violence, and tragedy of human history. My intention with this podcast is to illuminate the parts of our history that have been in the dark for far too long. I want to take a comprehensive dive into our world and to give a different and new perspective on our past. After all, education is our strongest weapon against tyranny. Please note, this podcast contains content and information that may not be suitable for children under the age of 13. Please be advised. During World War II, there was a lot of low morale amongst soldiers as they were unable to get their mail. Letters from loved ones that would certainly encourage them and push them to serve in the war. Due to this war, there was a shortage of personnel that were working in the postal division. Multiple times, there were attempts to secure more qualified workers, but even with that, the mail system was still faltering, and people were not getting their mail. In 1942, the United States Postmaster General had said that, quote, frequent and rapid communication with parents, associates, and other loved ones strengthens fortitude, enlivens patriotism, and makes loneliness endurable, and inspires to even greater devotion the men and women who are carrying on our fight far from home and from friends, end quote, which inspired the motto for the 688th Battalion, no mail, low morale. The creation of the Women's Army Corps, also known as the WAC, started in 1943, which came from the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which was signed into law in 1942 by Franklin D. Roosevelt. And the year after that, Congress approved legislation that would allow women to have full military status and enlist directly into the military. This was a historic move, as it was the first time that women were permitted to join the Army. Accepting Black women into the enlisted personnel in the WAC was thanks to the work of Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Dr. Bethune was the daughter of formerly enslaved parents, and she became one of the most important civil and women's rights leaders, an educator, and set educational standards for today's Black colleges. She later became an advisor to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which gave African Americans an advocate in government. However, just because there were now Black women being accepted as enlisted personnel does not mean that the rest of the Army agreed with or kept up with that progress. Black servicewomen would see their white counterparts being approved to serve overseas while they were ignored. Veteran member Anna Tarrick said, quote, first, we had to fight segregation, second was the war, and third were the men, end quote. Due to this, civil rights groups pushed the government to give Black WAC members the same opportunities as white women. In November 1944, the 688 came to life and had an all-Black WAC battalion of 824 enlisted personnel and 31 officers. They were the official Central Postal Directory Battalion. Lieutenant Colonel Charity Edna Adams, who was a major at the time, had commanded the battalion. They had their own headquarters and consisted of companies A, B, C, and D. Despite them not seeing combat and being tasked with support duties, they were still trained to be battle ready, including knowing the difference between different weapons, such as the German Karabiner 98B rifle and the American Winchester M12 shotgun. 688th member Gladys Carter said to the National Museum of the U.S. Army that, quote, "We had to climb ropes and come down the side of a ship as would if it were sinking. We had to do some crawling under wire. We had to put on gas masks. So that was part of it. A lot of marching and just getting ready, getting outfitted, that kind of thing." End quote. One day, there was a white general who had appeared for a surprise inspection. When he saw the part of the battalion that was missing, he chastised Major Adams for the poor attendance. The male general berated Major Adams, despite her trying to clarify that there was a reason that they were not there, as they were working one of the 3 shifts that ensured that the mail would be processed in a 24-hour period. The general threatened to send a white superior officer to show her how to do her job, despite her being capable of doing so. She told him in no uncertain terms, quote, "Over my dead body, sir," end quote. Not every member of the battalion was a mail clerk. There were also administrative personnel, cooks, and staff that were special service who managed the recreation for the unit. In February of 1945, they were setting sail to Birmingham, England, but before they had gone to England, they landed in Scotland after a dangerous voyage. In Scotland, there was an explosion of a German V-1 rocket, which made them have to run for cover. Segregation was still a thing, and they faced it at their own work. They had to eat in a separate cafeteria, had separate recreational facilities, and their living quarters were separated not just by gender, but by race as well. The battalion faced the same racism that they had in the United States, and the American Red Cross had refused to give them hotel accommodations, and so there was a separate facility that they stayed in. This caused Major Charity Adams, the leader of the battalion, to lead a boycott of the facilities. Quote, "The Red Cross wanted to set up another hotel for the black WACs, and I promised them that it would be over my dead body before anybody slept there. And nobody slept there to my knowledge." End quote. Adams explained. In Birmingham, England, their workspaces were cold, barely lit warehouses that had packages and letters, all long forgotten, stacked up within the space. Packages that had sugary gifts in them had long since been ripped open by rats, and the rats had eaten the now spoiled items. The servicewomen worked through the winter wearing heavy coats and long johns. The workers would be working in blackout conditions with the windows painted over with dark paint so that they could be shielded from the presence of German forces. The first thing that the 6888 did was develop a tracking system for the service members that were fighting. This helped prevent the wrong mail going to soldiers with the same name, which meant that there were 7 million information cards that had to be kept. The women were apparently fascinating to locals who would stop by and watch them work, and helped the 6888 form friendships with the local community. Sometimes they would even be invited to tea by locals. They were even sent at one point to parade in front of Mary, the Queen Mother. Despite the criticism, these women were effective, and they could process about 65,000 pieces of mail in one shift. The backlog, which originally was anticipated to take 6 months, only took 3 months. They were so successful and so good at their job that they were asked to go to Rouen, France, where there was a 3-year backlog, and that was processed and cleared in 3 months. Sadly, in July of 1945, there was a car accident that caused Privates Mary Bankston and Mary Barlow to lose their lives, and a month later, Sergeant Dolores M. Brown passed away due to her injuries from the accident. The War Department did not pay for funerals, but First Lieutenant Dorothy Scott had found some battalion mates that had mortuary experience. The 3 ladies were laid to rest at Normandy's American Cemetery on Colleville-sur-Mer. They were buried with honors, and their battalion sisters paid for their caskets. In October of 1945, the battalion moved to Paris, where they had better treatment than they had faced in the United States, having a maid service and cooked meals for them, but they still faced segregation and racism. Something I found personally disturbing was that, according to the National Museum of the U.S. Army, that there were male black service members who believed that these women had been brought there solely to be companions for them. It was also there that they had to deal with the package thefts and would work with the local citizens to help recover the packages. They had a daunting workload, and the workforce just got cut significantly. In February 1946, the battalion finally ended up coming back home, and there was little to no fanfare. The only one who got recognized was the leader, Major Adams, who rose to the ranks of lieutenant colonel. There are institutions such as the National Archives for Black Women's History that have kept their legacy alive. In 2018, a monument that honored the 6888 was erected in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and the 6888 received the Meritorious Unit Commendation the next year. In 2021, they received the Congressional Gold Medal of Honor awarded by Joe Biden, and in 2022, there was a surviving 6888 hero who was found in New York. Her name is Cresenia Garcia, and even her family was unaware that she had served. Oprah Daily and CBS News both did stories on her, and she passed away August of 2023 at 103 years old. In 2024, Tyler Perry released a new drama about the 6888 that will be streaming on Netflix as of December 20th, starring Kerry Washington as Major Charity Adams. Damani Davis, an archivist of the 6888, said, quote, "The lack of recognition experienced by these Black women upon their return typified the general indifference and even hostility that Black veterans generally receive from the broader American public after the Second World War. But like their Black male counterparts, the overseas experience of these women provided them with the extra motivation and the determination to fight even harder against the inequities in their homeland." End quote. If you are looking for sources for this episode, please check out our show notes. Transcripts and sources will also be on my website, notyourhistoryclass.com. Researching, hosting, and production and editing is all done by Lauren Powers. Theme song and episode music is done by Mike Myers. You can find him at the Mike Show 42 on X. If you have any recommendations or suggestions for a future episode, you can direct message me via social media or email me at notyourhistoryclass@gmail.com.